Exploration of the Pico de Orizaba Obsidian Mines. Episode 1, Trekking to the Aztec Mines on Citlatépetl. Oral tradition recorded Pico de Orizaba erupted when Quetzalcoatl was buried on the summit in 987 CE or 1175 CE. This eruption ejected clouds of ash and glowing hot rocks. Moreover, the eruption occurring from 1264 CE to 1265 CE was stated to have been the most violent one to occur, producing ash columns, blue flames of sulfur burn, and lava, while ash covered the flanks of the volcano. The volcano is currently dormant but not extinct, with the last eruption taking place during the 19th century. It is the second most prominent volcanic peak in the world after Mount Kilimanjaro. Photographed, written, and podcast video produced. Directed and programmed by Jack Lamb. Dr. Terry Stocker and Jack Lamb. Photograph taken in 1981 as we ascended the volcano, Pico de Orizaba, to explore, photograph and survey the lost Aztec mines. When outlining our expedition in the latter months of 1980, the primary objective would be to ascend to the upper reaches of the volcano, Pico de Orizaba, called Citlatépetl in the Náhuatl language of the Aztec. At 18,500 feet, it is the highest mountain in Mexico and the third highest in North America after Alaska's Denali and Canada's Mount Logan. On the upper reaches of the slopes of this volcano we intended to explore, photograph, and survey a group of ancient lost obsidian mines quarried by the Mesoamerican Aztec for centuries before the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the New World and destroyed their civilization. Victory of Cortés over the Aztec from the Codex Aztecatlan. Dr. Terry Stocker was the leader of our expedition, as well as an accomplished archaeologist, anthropologist, ethnographer, writer, and world traveler in his own right. Having spent much of the previous 11 years working in Mesoamerica, he was knowledgeable and experienced to a degree few managed to achieve. Stocker and fellow archaeologist Robert Cobbeen discovered the mines in 1971 based on a search proposed by the latter's professor. And on 6 occasions during the next decade, they repeatedly made the long trek on foot up the volcano to try to explore the Aztec mines. But each attempt failed due to the remoteness of the mines, the persistent inclement weather making travel difficult, and unbelievably bad luck. Like other pre-Columbian civilizations, the Aztec used obsidian, a form of volcanic glass, for weapons, knives, razors, tools, and the household objects used in virtually every aspect of their daily lives. Obsidian also had great value as a trade commodity, and subsequently helped to support and sustain the economy of their vast Aztec empire. To commence the story at the beginning, Cobbeen got involved with obsidian as early as 1969 when as a graduate student he began working with Michael Coe at Yale University. Professor Coe was one of the first to suggest the Orizaba volcano had to be a pre-Columbian source for obsidian, and he sent Cobbeen on a fact-finding mission to the Mexican state of Veracruz to discover where this obsidian source might be located. Eventually he learned about some hill mines on the Orizaba slopes from a professor in Córdoba, who said he had visited them once in the 1940s. But over the next 2 years, every time Cobbeen tried to get to the mines, the bad weather foiled his attempts. Then in 1972, he teamed up with Terry Stocker to look for the mines. After days asking locals for information in numerous pueblos on the eastern slopes of the volcano, they met a man who knew the location of the mines, and was willing to take them there. Since it was the rainy season, travel proved difficult. And with their new guide to lead them, they climbed to the volcano's northern upper plateau where they were elated to discover an unmolested group of large obsidian taluses cascading down the steeply canted south-facing slope of a valley. But no sooner did they arrive than the pervasive rains increased in force and intensity, and their guide insisted they leave immediately before the steep trail down the mountain washed away. In later years, Cobbeen and Stocker made 2 more trips to the Citlatépetl Valley to gather samples from the obsidian taluses. And based on pottery fragments excavated in a test pit dug on a man-made farming terrace extending 300 yards east to west along a ridge below the taluses, they learned the Aztec were but the last to mine obsidian on the volcano. For the shards found at deeper levels indicated other cultures had preceded the Aztec by 2 millennia. Regrettably, the ceramic experts they contacted could not definitively identify the cultures linked to these fragments. Receiving a grant for a trace element analysis at the University of Missouri Research Reactor, they returned to the Orizaba mines to gather additional samples to be tested in the nuclear reactor. And though nuclear samplings of archaeological sites were uncommon, a comparative analysis of volcanic glass samples taken from San Lorenzo proved the Olmec used obsidian from the Pico de Orizaba source as early as 1000 BC. On their last expedition to the mines the prior year in 1980, Stocker and Cobain inadvertently discovered that several shafts were not sealed as they had believed. But without the proper equipment to allow them to explore underground, their attempts to learn the secrets hidden within the earth were thwarted. With but a single flashlight between them, they were ill-equipped to do more than stare into the dark cavities, and make plans to return the following year with the equipment needed to explore the mines. On this, their final 1981 expedition to the Pico de Orizaba obsidian mines, Stocker asked Jack Lamb to assist him, both as photographer, and for his expertise in karst cave exploration, cave photography, and cave mapping, which hopefully would apply within shafts and tunnels cut from volcanic glass. Equipped with lights, ropes, cameras, and surveying gear, we planned to explore, photograph and survey the mine shafts and tunnels. Accompanying us on our expedition were Stocker's wife Barbara Jackson, also an archaeologist/anthropologist, as well as a college friend and fellow cave explorer, Frank Schultz. Regrettably, at the last minute Robert Cobain was unable to accompany us up Pico de Orizaba. Leaving later that afternoon, we drove until midnight before stopping to sleep, then finished the drive to the volcano in the morning. Stocker's route would take us east to Pachuca, then southeast through Cacaxtla to Tlacachuca, the last actual pueblo on the slopes of the volcano. From there we would ascend to the small settlement of Omacalco El Cajon, where we would leave our vehicle and continue our ascent on foot. Dawn broke and illuminated our surroundings earlier hidden in the pre-dawn gloom, revealing a surprisingly unexpected environment. Dry and arid, yet fresh and promising in its desolate pristine emptiness, the snow-capped volcano Citlatépetl beckoned us to approach and kneel in homage. Its towering majesty rose to a godlike 18,500 feet, far greater than the mere mortal 14,000-foot volcanic belt summits visible to the north. Even the army of Maguey spotting the sun-baked plain saluted the massive volcano's grandeur with towering 30 feet tall flower stalks, seemingly spectral silhouettes of upraised lances backlit by the rising sun. With almost no objects made by the hand of man to distract us, we stopped to examine an ancient stone column, which Stocker identified as a colonial mile marker, with the numeral 8 carved into its face. At a loss as to its purport, we wondered if the numeral stood for a statute mile, a Roman mile, or some unit of distance long forgotten in the mists of time. Barbara solved the riddle by explaining it probably stood for a Spanish league or legua, measured at 15,000 paces or about 2.5 miles. The marker gave no indication about the identity of the terminus located at the indicated distance. So, we studied the map and conjectured it might mark the distance to our next destination, Tlacachuca. Despite the early morning hour, we found the pueblo of Tlacachuca to be already surprisingly active, with both the streets and mercado crowded with a multitude of people. The pole-peaked tarps of the market stalls suggested the white tents of an encampment of tinkers gathered outside the town to sell their itinerant wares to the locals. At 9,500 feet of elevation, frigid air in Tlacachuca justified the colorful serapes and woolen caps the people wore to fend off the morning chill. The Tlacachuca Mercado was like other open-air markets in Mexico. A sizable area contained rows of vendor stalls, tents, and sheds where a merchant could sell his or her produce or goods. People could buy every type of food and foodstuff, all types of household and dry goods, as well as handcrafted items of every kind at extraordinarily inexpensive prices. Bins and barrows crowded narrow lanes brimming with fresh fruits and vegetables, and assorted dried foods like beans, corn, fruits, and nuts, and even pots and pans. An assortment of vegetables for sale in the mercado. Vendors and their wares, shoppers and food stands crowded together in the lanes, overwhelming our senses with a cacophony of sounds and smells produced by the banter of customers bartering in Spanish or one of the Native American dialects, intermingled with the fragrance of sizzling street food, the stench of spoiled meat, and the raw alkalinity of the desiccated dust kicked airborne by many hundreds of bustling feet. Open-air butcher shops were the most intriguing, with a menagerie of flying-crusted carcasses on display. The sides, hinds, and quarters of various animals hung unrefrigerated from the tent rafters in the butcher stalls, the meats ostensibly freshly cut from steers, pigs, goats, and sheep slaughtered that same day. Goat and sheep heads lay atop the countertops near chickens with their feet, heads, and beaks still attached to the bodies. There were also bowls of animal brains called sesos, and many types of stuffed sausages generically known as chorizos. Some of the more exotic offerings Stalker pointed out to us included large tubs of dried grasshoppers called chapulins, giant black ant larvae called escamilles, and edible red maguey worms called chinoquils. "Hey Frank, come over here and try a spoonful of this Citlatépetl," Stalker recommended innocuously. "What is it?" Frank asked, suspiciously studying a bowl of what was best described as a sticky black goo. "It's a smut fungus that grows on corn," he replied innocently. "Trust me, Citlatépetl is a rare delicacy." "Jesus, it smells like bird shit," Frank retorted aghast after putting his face near the bowl to smell it. "Good call," Stalker commended with a crooked grin. "That's probably why Aztecs called it Citlatépetl, which roughly translates as raven's excrement." The cross atop the white bell tower rising in tiers over the town pointed to the culmination of Citlatépetl's conical crown. Though still nearly 10 miles distant, the cratered summit tangibly loomed overhead, towering another 9,000 feet above the town. Because the vegetables in the mercado looked surprisingly fresh, we bought enough to fill a large bag before leaving town on the lone road heading eastward while rising into the mountains. It was easy to see why pre-Columbian people came to revere the volcanoes as gods. Something palpable about Citlatépetl obliged us to anthropomorphize its presence and give it animistic credence. Even the air carried the scent of the volcano and compelled us to glance upwards at its bulk, if only to verify it kept its distance. Near the outskirts of town, another church with an oddly brilliant white dome quietly sat sentinel. As if so insignificant a ward could stop the volcano's molten fury should it ultimately decide to erupt. White Dome Church higher up the slope of the volcano. As our VW van moved up the lower reaches of the volcano, a strong sense of excitement welled in us, alongside a shared feeling of commitment to undertake a challenge in a locale where men seldom travel. As we gained altitude, our road penetrated a forest of towering conifers obscuring the slopes above, and at times the landscape below. But trees would never be tall enough to hide the volcanic dome swelling in magnitude high above us with every turn and twist of the ever-steep gradient. Then in less than an hour our trail abruptly ended, deep in a forest of tall conifers, at the very small enclave of Omacalco El Cajon positioned at 11,000 feet of elevation. Outwardly too small to warrant the appellation of a pueblo, Omacalco El Cajon was merely a collection of houses made of roughsawed pine planking or adobe. Its only store doubled as a bar, and its only other business, if we did not count the white church, was a sawmill set in a clearing upslope of the settlement. We never learned how the hamlet received the name El Cajon, which in Spanish meant the drawer. While the lumber mill had electrical power, most of the village did not. However, an electric line did run from the mill to an isolated pole set near a house on the edge of town. Driving through the hamlet, Stalker said to stop at this very house, belonging to his friend Ciro Tinclay, who would guide us up the volcano to the Obsidian mines. And almost as if he knew of our arrival, a short solid-built man dressed in a white western hat with rolled brims and a blue jean jacket over a collared shirt, appeared leading a horse and burro. Selecting what gear we would need on the volcano, we lumbered across town and deposited our loads at a corral. Then Stalker and Jack went back to fetch what remained. And by the time we returned, Ciro and his sons had 2 horses saddled, and our gear loaded and tied on a pair of burros. Once satisfied the loads would not shift, Ciro said we could leave. The corral was built with split pine posts set vertically into the ground one next to the other, looking more like a stockade or palisades than a corral. If its purpose was to keep animals in, then there was no reason to build it this stout. But if its intent was to keep wild animals out and away from livestock, then it was well suited to its purpose. With the preparations for our journey completed, Ciro and his sons led the saddled horses and laden burros out of the corral as we began our trek up the volcano to the Aztec obsidian mines. "Ya nos vamos!" Ciro loudly called out, "We are leaving," and our cavalcade got underway. Straggling at first until everyone found the pace, we moved along the dusty trail traversing the angled slope at a less severe gradient. Traveling single file, our motley crew left Omacalco El Cajon behind Ciro, who walked at the head of our column while driving one of the pack burros. Taking in the beautiful scenery while looking for photogenic subject matter, I marveled anyone could farm the steep slopes we crossed. For the industrious residents of Omacalco El Cajon clearly worked as farmers as well as lumberjacks to earn their livings. Clearing trees and stumps off the mountainside near the hamlet settlement, they turned angled meadows into cropland, and in so doing, created a hypnotic pattern of congruent parallel furrows cut by hand in the soil. Meandering transversely across the canted slope, the undulations avoided the stands of pines like tidal ripples around rocky outcrops on a shoreline. From my experience with climbing 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado, I knew I had to pace myself from the outset of our march to maintain steady and stress-free movement in the thin air. As the body tires, we lengthen our stride in the mistaken belief it allows us to keep pace. But because less oxygen reaches our legs, they tire faster. To compensate, each time my breathing quickened as the gradient increased, I forced myself to shorten my stride until I no longer felt winded, thereby preventing my limbs from tiring because of inadequately oxygenated muscles. Of course, it helped that I spent the last few months at high altitude, so my capillaries had sufficient time to expand to accommodate the oxygen my muscles required to work efficiently in the thin air. Also, I consciously decided to walk rather than ride, but not because I was a stranger to horses. My ex-wife Nancy was a devoted horsewoman, so we usually had 3 or 4 head at Singing Stones. But it had been a year since I sat astride a horse, and I knew how thigh muscles used to guide the mount would complain about the unaccustomed exercise in the following days when we crawled through twisted warrens of volcanic glass exploring the mines, a prospect I wanted to avoid. Regrettably, at this altitude Barbara and Frank had neither the experience nor the physical conditioning to sustain the brisk pace Ciro set for us for more than 10 minutes at a time without stopping to rest. I tried coaching them on how to move and breathe at high altitude, but they were either unable or unwilling to take my advice. For a time, Frank and Barbara took turns riding the horse, trading off whenever the one on foot became too tired or breathless to walk. But unaccustomed to riding as they were, the discomfort of the saddle proved not to be an improvement over traveling afoot. Consequently, after 4 hours on the trail they both were so exhausted, alternately sharing a horse was no longer enough to keep our column moving. Therefore, Ciro made Stalker give up his mount so Barbara and Frank could ride all the time. Our view of Citlatépetl's snow-covered summit was superb as we climbed above the clouds clinging to the forested ravines between the mid-level ridgebacks. With each hour, the distance separating us from the upper reaches of the volcano closed, until we nearly achieved timberline where the crest of the wide plateau extended north towards us from the cratered peak. Across the slopes directly to our south, we could see the connecting ridge leading to the snowy summit. And looking west into the setting sun before twilight obscured our westward view, we enjoyed an unimpeded view of Mexico's central highlands to the volcanic rim formed by Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl on the horizon. Exhausted from the long climb, yet pushing to cover as much ground as possible before nightfall, in the twilight we finally elected to camp. Then the next day, after 6 hours spent crossing the high divide marking the end of the highlands, we reached the eastern extent of the high plateau, descending precipitously to the Gulf Coast. Cresting the last ridge, Stalker eagerly pulled me towards the lip of the ledge, while Barbara and Frank stayed a horse safely back from the edge alongside Ciro and his sons with the burros. Speaking as he waved an arm in an exaggerated arc to include the valley at our feet, a contracted V-shaped basin ending prematurely at the brink of the plateau's periphery, he notified me that we progressively closed in on our ultimate destination. Breaking camp shortly after sunup the next morning, after 6 hours spent crossing the high divide marking the end of the highlands, we reached the eastern extent of the high plateau, descending precipitously to the Gulf Coast. Cresting the last ridge, Stalker suddenly pulled Jack towards the lip of the ledge. speaking as he waved an arm in an exaggerated arc to include the valley at our feet, a contracted V-shaped basin ending prematurely at the brink of the plateau's periphery. He notified Jack that we progressively closed in on our ultimate destination. "This is the head of the Citlatépetl Valley," Stalker cried out, using the Náhuatl name he coined for the valley, which meant place of obsidian. "Those black splotches on the north slope at the end of the valley are the obsidian taluses trailing down the incline below the mines." "I see them," Jack exclaimed once he located the taluses. Breathing hard as we picked up the pace in the thin air, it required another 90 minutes for us to cross the remaining distance to the bluff where Ciro abruptly stopped our column beside a shallow rock shelter under an overhang offering some protection from rain or snow. Perhaps because none of us disagreed when he declared that the narrow level patch of earth at the base of the cliff was a good campsite, without waiting for a response, he and his sons unilaterally began unloading the burros. Once they stacked everything against the cliff face, he surprised us by announcing that he and his sons were returning to Omicalco El Cajon. Claiming their mounts would travel faster on the downhill ride, he said the full moon would provide enough light to ride throughout the night. While he insinuated his resolution to leave us as soon as we arrived had been a last-minute decision, considering how hard he pushed us to get here, it seemed likely he always intended to return home immediately. Citlatépetl assured us they would return with the horses and burros in 8 days' time to take us back to Omicalco El Cajon. And with a terse word of farewell, he and his sons rode off. Only after they passed beyond view did we turn our attention to setting up camp. Gathering stones pre-blackened with soot, Frank made a fire ring 6 feet from the cliff wall. Abruptly telling us to look up, he pointed out a discoloration on the underside of the overhang suggesting campfires had been built here long ago, perhaps even by the Aztec. We had assumed our elevation put us above timberline. Nevertheless, many stunted trees grew on the south-facing slope to provide us with an unlimited supply of firewood. Still, if we wanted a campfire that night, we needed to gather wood before darkness caught us unprepared for the cold. After the difficult exertions during our ascent over the last 2 days, the effort needed to round up and carry firewood back to our camp in the thin air proved more exhausting than we imagined. Hence, it was evening before we completed preparations for our first night on the volcano. The excitement of finally being on the volcano countered any fatigue Stalker and Jack felt. So when the nearly full moon began to rise above the mountains, they descended to the nearest talus below their camp. The amassed obsidian fragments blanketing the expansive area were mostly comprised of percussion debitage, presumably produced by Aztec craftsmen over the centuries. Awed by the knowledge they stood in the presence of a treasure trove of artifacts, they forgot about their fatigue and did not return to camp until the moon was high above in the starry sky. That first night in camp on Pico de Orizaba, Barbara and Frank began to suffer from excessive fatigue, coupled with an odd physical restlessness. However, given their strenuous ascent of the volcano in the extremely thin air at high altitude, their fatigue seemed understandable. Unfortunately, they soon began vomiting repeatedly during the night until nothing was left in their stomachs to expel. And even then, they tried to dry heave and gag reflexively every few minutes. Any exertion they expended resulted in a manifold increase in their symptoms. And even the effort required to vomit radically escalated the agony in their throbbing heads, pulsing in intensity to the tempo of each belabored breath. It was obvious they both suffered from acute cases of altitude sickness. By sunrise, the debilitating sickness precipitated by the high altitude had not diminished for either of them. The only cure was to move to a lower altitude, but their symptoms kept them from even moving, let alone walking, effectively trapping them at the 13,800 feet elevation producing their infirmity. While Stalker and Jack debated their options, they found no immediate solution to ease their distress. We merely could hope they might acclimatize to the altitude in time, and the sickness would dissipate. We never expected Barbara and Frank to recover enough to enter the mines on the morrow. But we both knew from experience that even when healthy, both of them tended to start the day slow. So try as we might to remain optimistic about their quick recoveries, as sick as they were it was impossible not to consider the possibility they might not get up to speed until Citlatépetl returned for us. And as it turned out, by the time they recovered from altitude sickness, they both lost interest in the mines and quickly disengaged from our joint expeditionary objectives. As it happened, neither recovered until day 6, when Stalker cajoled them into entering the mines to pose for scale in Jack's photographs. Look for the next YouTube podcast episode of Exploration of the Pico de Orizaba Obsidian Mines. Episode 2, Working on a Volcanic Slope at 13,800 feet.